The Physick Book of Deliverance Dane by Katherine Howe. Of course, Connie began, shoving her anxiety aside. The temptation is to begin a discussion of witchcraft in New England with the Salem Panic of 1692, in which 19 townspeople were executed by hanging. But the careful historian will recognize that panic is an anomaly and will instead want to consider the relatively mainstream position of witchcraft in colonial society at the beginning of the 17th century. Connie watched the four faces nodding around the table, planning the structure of her answer according to their responses. Most cases of witchcraft occurred sporadically, she continued. The average witch was a middle-aged woman who was isolated in the community either economically or through lack of family, and so was lacking in social and political power. Interestingly, research into the kinds of maleficium, her tongue tangled on the Latin word, sending it out with one or two extra syllables, and she cursed inwardly for giving in to pretension, which witches were usually accused of, reveals how narrow the colonial world really was for average people, whereas the modern person might assume that someone who could control nature or stop time or tell the future would naturally use those powers for large-scale dramatic change. Colonial witches were usually blamed for more mundane catastrophes, like making cows sick or milk go sour, or for the loss of personal property. This microcosmic sphere of influence makes more sense in the context of early colonial religion, in which individuals were held to be completely powerless in the face of God's omnipotence. Further, she continued, the Puritans held that nothing could reliably indicate whether or not one's soul was saved. Doing good works wouldn't cut it, so negative occurrences like serious illness or economic reversal were often interpreted as signs of God's disapproval. For most people, it was preferable to blame witchcraft, an explanation out of one's own control and embodied in a woman on the margins of society, than to consider the possibility of one's own spiritual risk. In effect, witchcraft played an important role in New England colonies as both an explanation for things not yet elucidated by science and as a scapegoat. The Salem witch trials have been explained in numerous ways. Some historians have argued that the trials were caused by tension between competing religious populations in Salem, the more urban port city, on the one hand, and the rural farm region on the other. Some have pointed to long-standing envy between family groups, with particular attention paid to the monetary demands made by an unpopular minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. And some historians have even claimed that the possessed girls were hallucinating after having eaten moldy bread, which can cause effects similar to those of LSD. But I see it as the last gasp of Calvinist religiosity. By the early 18th century, Salem had moved from being a predominantly religious community to being more diverse, more dependent on shipbuilding, fishing, and trade. The Protestant zealots who had originally settled the region were being supplanted by recent immigrants from England who were more interested in the business opportunities in the new colonies than in religion. I think the trials were a symptom of this dynamic shift. They were also the last major outbreak of witchcraft hysteria in all of North America. In effect, the Salem Panic signaled the end of an era that had its roots in the Middle Ages. Not too far from here, witches were burned in Zurich in the Middle Ages as well. The landscape was probably the same, but how much change has society really undergone since that time? What do you think?